dream too big, if you're too radical, if you're too utopian, no one's going to trust you, no one's going to believe what you have to say. Far from it. Our vision is not a weakness, it is a strength. Because it inspires us to act. It gives us a roadmap so that even our biggest dreams can suddenly seem realistic. And finally, it helps us understand the systemic nature of the problem. So we're done with step one. Let's move on to step two. And good buddy Nico is going to come up and tell you a little bit more about how we can build a community around the vision.
Hey everybody, a lot of familiar faces, also a lot of new faces, which is exciting. Clearly a vision, a bold vision is necessary, right? This roadmap of what we want to achieve, it's incredibly necessary. But what we're going to be talking about now is that it's not sufficient, right? And so what we're going to be talking about right now is that the need for such a vision to be embedded within a community if that vision is to be manifested and to be successful in the long term. So we're going to be looking at 3 different case studies, kind of looking at movements that fell short because of a lack of community, and then movements that achieved tremendous success because of the community that they were embedded within. So our first example is from the Arab Spring, right? This wave of popular uprisings against authoritarian regimes throughout the Middle East and the greater Arab world. It's a pretty moving picture, right, from the movements. Does anyone see maybe what's wrong with this image? Spot something?
Only men.
Only men, right? That's the number one. Is there anything else that stands out?
Too aggressive, maybe? Like angry?
They are passionate, right? But anything else?
They are angry.
And maybe they have reason to be angry, right? But anything else that comes to mind? The gender thing is number one, right?
Yeah. You really don't know what they're advocating for.
Yeah, that's also interesting. Generally speaking, it's a very, very young demographic, right? It's a group of young men. And so what we're trying to say is that real movements, effective movements, are dimensions of community. And a real community are diverse. Like by definition, real communities are about 50% women, right? And so if we have a social movement that has this type of demographic, a group of young men, it is very clearly not representative of the greater community. And so this manifests a number of problems, right? So at the very get-go, half of the population, half of the community isn't feeling welcome to be present. And in that aspect, that also half the community isn't having their views, their values represented within the movement. So an incredibly powerful movement, but also not one built on true community. And for that reason, it ran into some issues and didn't have, I guess, the results that so many people in this area dreamed of. Moving on to another example, Gezi Park. Has anybody here heard of Gezi Park? So Gezi Park was a beautiful park in Istanbul, Turkey. It was one of the last major green spaces in the city. In 2013, the government announced that they were going to destroy this park and replace it with luxury condominiums. So a group of 50 activists said, you know, enough is enough. Like, we're not going to have this, basically, over our dead bodies. So they came and they occupied this park. And they were met with a pretty brutal crackdown by riot police, like water cannons, tear gas. And this picture in particular went viral from the crackdown. This young woman in a red dress getting tear gassed. So this picture in particular sparked the movement. 50 people turned into 1,000 people, turned into tens of thousands of people, a little over 10,000 people in the city of Istanbul. Mobilizing, using direct actions, protesting against this issue, but also against a whole other host of issues, because there was an underlying sentiment against the authoritarian regime that was in place at this time, and it's still in place today. So they were so effective at really shutting down the system, and shutting down the city in particular, that the city government officials came to them and offered to negotiate. Basically saying, like, look, we're sorry, let's set up a time, like, let's talk, figure out where we can come and meet in the middle. Can anybody guess what happened at this point? Because really, it's pretty remarkable. They went from 50 people in a park to now having the government apologize for their actions, offering to change and coming to negotiate. Well, the first challenge was figuring out who those people were that were going to be negotiating, right? This movement started so fast, so quickly, it was not organized, it was very disparate. They didn't even know who was going to be going to the negotiating table. And once they finally got this group together, they spoke with government officials for 9 hours. which led to no consensus. The activists couldn't come to agreement on what they wanted, what vision they wanted, and the outcome that they wanted to see happen. And so this lack of consensus, disorganization, led folk that were in the parks, in the movement, in the streets, to start dissipating. And when that energy started dissipating, police were able to come through, sweep, and clear out the parks, clear out the camps, and really put an end to this movement. So let's take a step back. This movement in the coming days actually sparked 3.5 million activists, right? 3.5 million out of a population of 80 million to be on the streets, and 5,000 different protests rallying against then Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who is the now President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So it had this tremendous potential that collapsed. And so now the real question is, why did that happen? Like, what was it lacking? It was a much more diverse community. It was a much better representation of society, but it still wasn't quite the community that we're looking for. So our final example is looking at an example of community that was effective at driving change and driving it surprisingly quickly. So in the civil rights movement, more particularly Freedom Summer. So June 1964, 1,000, mostly college students from around the country, went down to the Deep South to begin registering folk to vote, people of color to vote. At the time, Mississippi in particular, only 5% of African Americans were registered to vote. And registering people to vote was a dangerous act. It was met with violence, it was met with immense crackdowns. So these activists, thousands, so students who came down and local activists were arrested. Over 80 of them were beaten very, very seriously. 67 black homes, churches, and businesses were either burned or bombed. One of these churches, activists were investigating kind of what happened, and 3 of those activists were killed. Right? So this level of repression against these activists was really crazy. And yet, a year later, 1965, they won. Lyndon B. Johnson passed the Voting Rights Act, really putting into law the right of every individual to vote. More than that, dismantling voter oppression like literacy tests and all these other forms of state, I guess, coercion to prevent people of color and other disenfranchised groups from voting. And so the question is, like, how were they able to be effective, and so effective so quickly, when the protesters in Turkey and Gezi Park were not? And by all accounts, it should have been the exact opposite, right? Like the mobilization in the Gezi Park protests, 3.5 million people, in a political context that was really ripe for change, failed. And in this situation, a much lower level of turnout, a much higher level of political oppression, and yet they were able to win. Well, in short, in an answer, the answer is community and connections in the community. To dig into this a little bit more, Stanford professor Doug McGavin asked himself this exact same question. And so he ran a multivariate regression analysis to really determine what factors led this movement to be successful. And more specifically, what led activists to get engaged in the movement and what caused activists to fall out of the movement. So we looked at a number of factors, like geographic factors, demographic factors, like age, gender, race, education levels. And after all of it, did any of you guess what the conclusion was? Does anyone here know how to read a regression table?
Well, they usually mark it with asterisks. So the ones that are statistically significant will have 1 or 2 asterisks after the number. You very generously have pointed out the lines that we're looking for with that beautiful big red arrow.
That is exactly right. Right? So this table right here, this column, is looking at the significance, or the way that this factor, the way that this variable impacts the outcome. Right? So it's impact in the end result of the equation. And so as Gail was mentioning, these asterisks mark a level of significance, right? A level of statistical significance that shows that it's not like by chance or it's not coincidental, but it actually does really have very rigorous statistical significance. And by far the most significant factor here, strong tie to participant or known activist. 60%. It's really astronomical, this data. So that basically is saying that if an activist has a strong attachment, a strong personal connection to somebody else who's in the movement, their likelihood of joining is 60% higher than it otherwise would be. The second most statistically significant variable is a strong tie to withdrawal. Meaning, if you're in the movement and someone that you're very close to leaves, there's a 40% likelihood that that activist is also going to leave. So just looking at someone's strong connections to other people in the movement, right? Hers are base level. If you have a friend who gets in the movement, you're 60% more likely to join. If you have a very close friend who leaves the movement, you're 40% likely to leave. Right? That's a 100% swing right there, just based on one's personal connections in the movement. And so DXE, looking at this data, was like, wow, I mean, this is what causes resiliency in movements. It's personal connections in community. If a community is able to develop those kind of personal connections to people within the movement, that gives it tremendous resilience. And it's what enabled the Freedom Summer, Freedom Riders to maintain their resiliency, maintain their momentum when the people at Gezi Park fell apart. And it's that importance of personal, intimate connections to the movement. So DXE tries to put that lesson into practice. And this can be practiced, again, in any organization, any movement. But the idea is that real change is built on community. And so DXE tries to spend just as much time organizing protests as they do community events. So going back to that black church that was burnt to the ground, 3 activists were killed investigating it. That black church was not a protest organization, right? It was a community organization where folk came together to eat, to pray, to laugh, to cry. And that was the dynamic that brought the community together, and it was that community that was able to make a tremendous change. And so in New York City, we don't necessarily have that kind of infrastructure built yet, and that's what we're going to be talking later about maybe creating. But looking at just at the Bay Area, so the Bay Area DXE chapter is by far the most prolific, the most robust example that we can give in this example. So every Saturday, they have what are called Saturday meetups, where everybody in the area comes together, shares food, shares stories, celebrates, maybe mourns, and just builds community. But that is just one level of it. But I guess before I go on, something that's really unique about this within the AR scene and within just social movements in general is that it's totally flat, right? It's a community. Most groups, employees are different from organizers, are different from supporters, and there's like a weird hierarchy in there. And the goal here is to kind of erode that hierarchy and create a genuine community amongst all activists, everyone who's interested in the cause. But even this we don't think is enough, right? Because it's missing the close, intimate connections that we just learned are the foundation for real community and real social change. So what they also have are circles. Every week, 4, 5, maybe 7, 8 activists come together, share food, share laughs, and really develop the one-on-one connections that this movement needs to succeed. Rather than being an anonymous face within a community, what circles do is it really personalizes it. It gives you this direct, immediate connection to someone else in the movement. You can see how they're doing, they can see how you're doing, really inspire each other. And so this is the building block, right? These one-on-one connections and these small group connections, the building block for the community, and the community is this building block for the greater movement. The last thing to talk about here is this idea of self-governance, right? So communities rely on trust. An authoritarian organization and a community organization are polar opposites, right? They're really autonomous to each other, they're perpendicular. And so the idea of having a robust community, for that to exist, we have to have it based on self-government, in particular principles of democracy and transparency. So again, this is applicable to in any context, but within the DXE context, organizers, leaders are all voted. They're democratically put in place by other members who see what they're doing and believe in their work ethic and what they're willing to put into the organization. So that's one aspect of it, the democratic organization. The other part is transparency, being fully open. Oh, sorry, and one more thing about the democratic structure. Even the budget is voted on, right? So chapter members vote on where we want to be dedicating the budget, dedicating the organization's resources. And this kind of self-governance gives all community members tremendous buy-in into the vision, into where we're going, and into our belief that we can and we do matter. The other aspect of it is transparency. So being like totally open, right? All these meetings are open to the public. In fact, DXE often invites the CEOs of Big Ag to these meetings, or the fiercest critics, most vociferous critics. And sometimes they take them up on these offers, right? And so the idea is It's not to be doing like some insular organizing where there's a small group setting the agenda and other people that aren't to understand. The idea is to be really transparent, inviting people in. And it's really based on this idea that we believe that people have the right to know and the right to express their voice. And when they know and express their voice, we all benefit from it.
Yeah, so we have another exercise here, which I'm going to explain really fast, and then Wayne's going to facilitate. This one's pretty interesting. So what's going to happen is Wayne is going to read off a series of statements, and if this statement applies to you, you are going to stand up. So of course it's voluntary whether or not you want to participate, but I really encourage you all to participate. And I've written down 10 rules here that are going to help us have a successful exercise. So rule 1, what is said here stays here, so feel free to tell your story, but don't push anyone to tell their own story if they don't want to. But at the same time, what is learned here leaves here. Rule 2, this activity is nonverbal, so there's no need to speak while you're standing up. Number 3, challenge by choice. So the amount of participation is up to you. If you feel triggered for some reason, definitely feel free to leave the room. And if someone's not acting it, don't read into it. Number 4, for those who are participating, I encourage you to be fully present. So others who are observing, please give your full attention to the activity as well. 5, let's foster a brave space. So this is beyond a typical safe space. Participants might be taking a risk in sharing things that are personal to them. And while it can be uncomfortable to share things that are really personal to you, it can really actually help us grow as individuals and also grow as activists, as a group. Number 6, if you've done this activity before, remember it's a different experience from context to context and within different groups too. So there's always something new to learn. 7, be aware of who's standing up and who's not. 8, be respectful, obviously, of each other's beliefs and each other's positions. 9, please don't call out anyone. Each individual person might have their own different level of comfort with participating in this activity. And lastly, if anyone can't physically participate for some reason and you prefer not to stand up, you can also raise your hand. And so here, Wayne.
Okay, so let's go at it. Does everyone understand the exercise? And actually, because this is an exercise we're asking people to be brave and vulnerable, I'm going to ask you to take that camera and turn it off just for now. Thank you very much.
That they overcame. So initially they would protest on the farms, and then they got kicked out and they had to go to the roads. And so what did they do? They brought out loudspeakers. And then in response, what did the farm owners do? Well, they brought out loudspeakers of their own. What did the movement do in response? They would go to people's houses. So they were constantly viewing obstacles and overcoming them and in developing new tactics. And that's what the animal rights movement is doing, and that's what we have to do even more of. And when we talk about community, when we talk about leadership, at DXC, the fundamental value that we elevate at every opportunity, just like in these How to Change the World workshops, is this idea of radical candor and transparency. Is anyone familiar with this term, radical candor, or the book written by Kim Scott? So the idea is, with radical candor, if you really want to be a leader and if you really want to develop a tight-knit community, we have to learn this art of being able to give people compassionate feedback. And it's actually surprisingly not intuitive for most people. For most people, if we are upset with somebody else in our peer group or in some kind of collaborative capacity, our natural tendency is to not share that feedback with a person, but to share that feedback with other people whom we do trust. And what we're trying to argue is that's not what we should be doing. And we can contrast radical candor with these 3 different quadrants. In the upper left, we have ruinous empathy. And this is the idea that we're just nice to people all the time, no matter what we're actually feeling on the inside. And we have the exact opposite, which is obnoxious aggression. And this is when we criticize people, when we offer words of construction, they're framed in a way that is not necessarily compassionate to others. And we get to that point when we're so frustrated, when our criticism has built up over such a long period of time, that it just kind of comes out in a way that might not be received in a very compassionate manner. And that's also very harmful. But then the worst is manipulative insincerity. And this is where we have constructive feedback and we never actually deliver it to the other person, but we instead spread it. And in so many social movements, massive fracturing has happened because people were manipulatively insincere rather than radically candid. And the author of this book, Radical Candor, which has been popularized in a number of tech companies and churches and other hedge funds, very successful organizations, is that obnoxious aggression is actually better than ruinous empathy. Because in obnoxious aggression, we're at least giving feedback, we're giving them something to work with. But best of all is, of course, radical candor. And so I would actually just invite everyone, maybe just take 1 or 2 minutes and just think of maybe somebody in your life for whom you do have constructive feedback that you haven't yet delivered. And I'd love it if everyone could just maybe brainstorm just to yourselves, you don't have to share, but how you might think about delivering that feedback to that person. And I will do the same. All right, thanks. And just another few things that go along with this idea of radical candor that are very important to DXC. One is that we don't do call-outs. So when we have, as a general principle, so when we have criticisms, we deliver them to the individual privately, preferably in person. And we do it immediately. We don't sit on these things. And then finally, of course, we don't gossip. And we always try to maintain a 5-to-1 ratio of positive comments to constructive feedback. And one of the things about radical candor is that there is a social cost in giving constructive feedback to other people, right? There's oftentimes this fear that that they're going to be very hurt, that they're going to be very devastated. But what happens when you normalize this idea in a particular community is that you lower the social cost, right? Because if people are used to giving feedback, if they're used to receiving feedback, then when it does happen, it's not that big of a deal, right? If you're in a workplace, for example, that doesn't do that, and then you start hearing negative feedback, you might think, oh my God, am I about to be fired, right? Like, is something really bad going to happen? And it creates this kind of like stress response. But if the idea is normalized, then it's not a big deal at all. And in the Bay Area, we kind of have created this culture of almost like gamifying it, like who can be the most receptive to feedback, who can thank people the most when they deliver radical candor. So just some ideas that I really want to, that honestly cannot be emphasized enough because of how important they are over the long term to building community and building trust as we all become leaders in this movement. And so I just want to highlight a few examples of emergent leadership, all from the SF Bay Area. So this is Tanya, and she's an immigrant from Nicaragua, and she just got her green card. She's, I think, 22, and has been an activist since she was 18. And she had no work experience before doing DXC other than working in restaurants. And she's currently the leader of our Direct Action Committee, which is the committee that's responsible for setting out overall campaign strategy and planning protests and liaising with our legislative team. And we all have personal connectees, like kind of personal coaches. And she's actually my personal coach, and she's given me a great deal of help. And after every single one of our connections, she always says, well, do you have any feedback for me? And then I say yes or no, and then I ask her the same, and it's just kind of something that we do every time. And it's really helped both of us grow. This is Diane. And Diane retired a few years ago, and she, for a long time, had been feeling like she wanted to get more involved with activism, and she's just become this longtime beloved member of our local community. And I had the pleasure and honor of doing an open rescue with her that actually resulted in both of our prosecutions. Both of us ended up taking plea deals, not a big deal, although Wayne and Paul are still in that case, and we're hoping that it goes well. But just overall, just a true rock of our community and someone everyone really respects. And this is Dean. And Dean just graduated from Cal. And initially, Dean and I actually had long conversations because he had a lot of skepticism about DXC and confrontational tactics, but Dean has been arrested twice now at major factory farm occupations. This is an image from one of them from September of 2018 at Petaluma Poultry. And Dean is also, he was the former president of BOA, Berkeley Organization for Animal Advocacy. And he's now the primary liaison between BOA and DXC, and he's also helping Christina, Wayne, and myself on a major political project that's happening this year that you'll hear more about at some point. So again, so just to recap, leadership is about building a grassroots movement that can scale. It's about constant adaptation, and we get there in large part through radical candor. So I'm going to turn the next part over to Christina to do our third exercise.
All right, so this is going to be one of our last exercises. It's going to be kind of a team exercise. So you're going to pair up with someone you know in groups of 2, maybe someone you don't know very well. And you're going to talk about these 3 questions one at a time. Basically, I want to encourage everyone to really listen carefully to each other and try to remember what the other person is saying. We'll have a chance to share after this, so if you and your partner decide you want to share, make sure you both agree on that. And I'll encourage you to share each other's answers and kind of show each other that you can listen to each other and be there for each other.
Does anyone have any questions about the exercise before we start? This is an exercise in coaching, which is an important leadership ability. And what you need to do is listen to someone very carefully as they're sharing with you their struggles and their efforts to overcome their weaknesses and turn them into strengths. And it turns out even spending 5 minutes with someone who's coaching you can make a big difference in your own personal confidence. We want you to practice that by listening to the other person and then presenting to the group what the other person said. So you're going to listen very carefully what my partner's weakness, time they overcame their weakness, and step towards turning that weakness into a strength are. And then we share, you're going to share on behalf of your partner. You're going to speak on behalf of the other person, and they're going to speak on behalf of you.